So in anticipation of our next part, I will also go to this RBD packed object, and for the override attributes here, I will also want this to be overwritten with the active attribute that we create at the sub level. So now that we set up this active attribute here, we can go up, and let's go back up to where we have our pieces, and let's maybe create this active attribute over here after we attribute delete the color. So let's drop down an attribute VOP, place this here, and I will rename this to set active. And for this I will create a simple propagation effect which I will animate with keyframes. We could also set up this attribute with a solver and an attribute transfer which will be procedural with our points that we simulate, but honestly, because we need something very simple and we don't really need a lot of control over this, we will simply just animate this with keyframes. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So let's visualize this add node and go inside this attribute VOP. And from this P, I want to generate a distance, and I will fit this value. And let's maybe visualize this value. If I plug this into our CD attribute, I want to promote this source max value over here, and let's go up. So I want to increase this value until we get a nice gradient throughout all of these points. So maybe this should spread out all the way up to a value of, we can see here that we have 25, and maybe we have to go all the way up to 20. Okay, so now we basically have a value that goes from 0 from the center of our scene to a value of 1 close towards the edges of the points. Let's go back inside. And from here I will want to compare these values. So from the fit node I will drop down a compare. And I will say that if this value is greater than whatever value we place inside the second input, and I will actually promote this parameter, so the second input, and I will rename this to threshold. So if this value from the fit is greater than this threshold, then we will export this result to an attribute that's called active. So from here I will type bind export, and we have to make sure that the type is set to integer for our active attribute, and rename this to active. So now if I go up, let's go to our add node and let's preview this active attribute. So click on this and let's go to our visualizers, disable the dir, and let's go to our active attribute. Let's set this to a min and max of 0 and 1, and if I go to my attribute VOP, and as I increase the threshold, we should start seeing these pieces in the center turn blue. Alright? And this is a very basic and simple propagation effect. So as I go closer to this value of 1, we can see that we select all of them, and this threshold value basically represents how far we want our threshold to look. So if I set this to a value of 25, then I can make sure that all of these pieces will be considered. So let's go to our visualizers and also preview our dir attribute as well. And now we can animate this active attribute. Okay, so let's maybe start at a value of 0 at the first frame, and I will hold down Alt and left click to create a keyframe. Let's go forward to maybe where our dir attribute reaches the furthest extents. Okay, so maybe around here, and let's increase this until we completely cover all of these pieces. And we don't want this value to go completely out, because we want some of the pieces which are right on the edge of our surface geometry to be intact. So if these pieces on the edge won't move at all, this will ensure that when we combine our simulation pieces with the terrain pieces, that there is a seamless transition between the simulated parts and the non-simulated parts. So long story short, we have to just make sure that these pieces towards the edge won't be active and will not be affected by our forces. So I will maybe leave this threshold value at 0.75. Let's make sure that as I preview the animation, the active attribute is a little bit ahead of our direction attribute as well. So I can actually hold down Shift and left click this value over here to bring my graph editor, and we can further control our animation with these handles over here. So if I hold down Control and grab this tangent, I can scale this down, and maybe I can scale this up a little bit, so we can make sure that the active attribute is always ahead of our vector attribute. and we can see here that we might have to increase this a little bit more. And let's actually just add another keyframe here. So I will hold down Control Alt and click this curve to add another keyframe, and I will just drag this up so we can further control our animation. Okay, so this is our active, and let's maybe not make this start right at frame 0, so I'll just bring this over one frame with these vertical handles over here. So just bring this forward a frame. So let's just keep an eye on the blue dots here and just make sure that these are in front of our direction vector. Okay, and this should be fine. So what this will also mean is that these points here, these pieces here that turn blue, will also start to be affected by gravity. So some pieces will kind of slide a little bit and they will fall, and it will create some cracks in these areas over here between where the lining strikes. And if your goal were to maintain the terrain surface without any changes, only where the lining hits, then you would sort of have to create a mask for this active attribute to only affect parts outside of the lining. But for my own taste and from my experiments, I found that some sliding between some of these larger chunks in between the lining add a lot of visual interest to the overall look, and I kind of prefer them moving. But so just note that some of these pieces here, when they turn blue, they will start to be affected by gravity and they will slide a little bit. Let's turn off the visualizer now. Let's go to the first frame and let's go to our .NET and see what is the result that we get. Let's go inside, and maybe for the amplitude I will increase this to 50. Alright, then we can see that some of these pieces are falling here from the edges, and these should really not be active, which leads me to believe that maybe over here where we set up this active attribute, in this compare node we have to switch this to be less than. And let's go back now, and we should now have the proper result. So let's press play. Okay, so we can see that only the pieces in the middle where the active propagates will start to move. And now we are coming much closer to the look that we are after. So maybe I will leave this to simulate for a few frames, and we can also check if our height fill collisions are working as well, since we are now having pieces that are falling outside of the boundaries. And I will actually just create a flipbook from this. So we can see that the collisions with the height fill terrain are working, and we are on our way to create the final simulation.